Okay, I was just reminded of two things. One, this Thursday, September 17th, is Constitution Day. September 17th, you may know, was the day the Constitutional Convention finished its business and submitted the finished draft of the Constitution to the people of the United States. And a few years ago, Senator Byrd suggested that it be designated as Constitution Day. And every college I know which gets federal money is supposed to have an event discussing the Constitution. I don't know if this goes for other schools too. Middle schools as well, yeah. So it's a good thing. You know, you can't have enough discussion of the Constitution. Harvard's event this Thursday will feature former Justice David Souter, who will be talking about the Constitution. You should have gotten an email to this effect from the Extension School announcing this, so check for further details. And certainly next week we will be talking more about the Constitution. Now, someone else asked a good follow-up question to the Quock Walker case, and I should just make something clear about that. Justice Cushing, Judge Cushing, who was the chief of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, did not write a ruling about slavery's constitutionality. He was sitting as a trial judge. And we do have in the state archives his charge to the jury. This is the instructions the judge gives to the jurors, telling them what the outcome might be. And he tells them that the Massachusetts Constitution seems to indicate that one man cannot own another. The jury, they don't write down what their verdict is. They just announce it. These are 12 individuals who then hear the case. They hear the evidence for Mr. Jennison, the evidence for Mr. Walker, and after being instructed by Judge Cushing, they find for Mr. Walker. So essentially, it's not William Cushing who ends slavery in Massachusetts. It is the jury, these anonymous 12 jurors who hear a case. And then this establishes a precedent which comes to bear in other cases. So it's not Judge Cushing sitting on high, sending down thunderbolts, but Judge Cushing sitting with a bunch of jurors, a bunch of farmers from Worcester County, telling them what the law is, because the jurors aren't presumed to know what the law is, and the law now is that Quock Walker can't be a slave. So, very interesting development here. Any other questions, since I've been answering them? Okay. Now, I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that sometimes we talk about the Articles of Confederation, or at least we used to. I was told by one teacher here that she no longer does this. Says the Articles of Confederation were a rough draft of the Constitution, because she realized without my having to tell her that they weren't. The constitutions were fundamental laws, and the states would have fundamental laws. This confederation would not have a fundamental law because it's 13 different sovereign entities. It's one of these facts. If you look at the manuscript copy of the Declaration of Independence, it says the unanimous declaration, this is in small letters, the unanimous declaration of the 13 united, then in big letters, States of America. And up until the time of the Civil War, when you used the phrase United States, you would use it in the plural. The United States are. That is, these are states that are united. After the Civil War, it changes. It's the United States, one entity. But it's not clear in the 1770s, 1780s that this is one entity. It's 13 different sovereignties. Now, there are some things that the United States needed to do as one entity: raise an army, borrow money, that kind of thing. They can't have delegates from each state going to France asking for treaties, or to the Dutch asking for loans. They do these things as one entity. And so in 1776, they began sitting as a Congress, a continental Congress with delegates from each state. And in Congress, each state had one vote. No matter if there was a state like Virginia. There are 3 million people in the country as a whole, and about 400,000, 500,000 of them are in Virginia. You know, you can do the math and figure out what the other state populations or how big the other states must have been. They're not all the same size. Virginia is by far the largest. Second largest in 1776 is Pennsylvania. Okay? Third, anyone know?
New York?
No. No. Massachusetts. Fourth? You'll never get this one. No. Nah. North Carolina. Okay? We can keep going down, but South Carolina, you know, so the states, vast differences in sizes. Rhode Island, Connecticut, Delaware, pretty small. Maryland isn't that, well, Maryland is pretty substantial. It's around the size of North Carolina. Okay? You know, New Jersey isn't that big. New York isn't that big in population. It's growing. North Carolina is actually the fastest growing state at this time. Its population grows by 6 times between 1750 and 1780. Phenomenal growth in North Carolina. Okay, so you have some states that are really big and others that are small. And then also they have different sizes geographically. Of course, they all claim to the South Sea, except, of course, for New Jersey and Delaware and Rhode Island, which are kind of stuck. You know, in fact, there's a border dispute going on between Connecticut and Pennsylvania because settlers from Connecticut had gone out into the upper Susquehanna River Valley, a place they call Wyoming, and had set up towns there. And they sent delegates to the General Court at Hartford. Now, we look at a map and we see, well, that's in Pennsylvania. It actually, at this time, was controlled by the Delaware Indians, and the Connecticut folks had bought this from the Delaware without getting Pennsylvania's permission. Pennsylvania is also having border wars with New York, and so it's not one big happy family. Pennsylvania and Maryland also are constantly having conflicts. It's why in the 1750s they have this line drawn by Mason and Dixon to set the boundary. You know, but here Connecticut claims this tract to essentially taking the borders of Connecticut and draw them west to the Pacific Ocean, and you'll see what Connecticut claimed. And part of it's in this valley in Pennsylvania where they're setting up towns. And other parts in what is now Ohio, this place called the Western Reserve. It's the Western Reserve of Connecticut. Now, Virginia also claimed the entire Ohio River Valley. And remember, Virginia at this time counted, and everyone acknowledged this to be Virginia's claim, what are now West Virginia and Kentucky. But Virginia also claimed what are now Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. Probably, and Michigan too. Okay? Bless you. Pennsylvania also claimed much of this territory. So did New York. And you can see this is going to cause some problems. Well, and also New York and Massachusetts and New Hampshire are having trouble because they all have claims to what becomes Vermont. And apparently there are people up in Vermont who don't acknowledge the claims of any of their neighbors to the east, south, or west. So you have lots of conflict here. Now you have this Congress that is created out of necessity in 1774, and then at about the time Congress is declaring independence, yet another committee of Congress sets to work drawing up Articles of Confederation. The leader in this is John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, and Dickinson was very reluctant to support independence. Comes quite late to it, but he draws up the Articles of Confederation, which simply codify this arrangement which had come into existence in 1774, that each state will have one vote, each state can send 7 delegates to Congress, the states will pay these delegates. You know, they can send 7, they can send 1 if they want. The delegates can only serve, they're chosen by the state legislatures. They represent the states, okay? Chosen by the legislatures, can only serve 3 years. I don't think anyone would want to serve more than that, but you know, these guys would serve 3 years. And this Congress essentially would have jurisdiction over things which the states could not do. Raise a continental army, borrow money from foreign powers, make treaties with the Indians and with foreign powers, do this kind of thing. For the Congress to decide on anything, at least 9 of the states would have to agree. Anything really substantive, all states would have to agree. So it's not a body that operates through majority rule. It's a body that operates through, well, each state having an equal vote. And some states, Delaware, Rhode Island, New Jersey, would not give up this equal vote. If it's population, Virginia is going to have a lot more votes than Delaware. So Virginia, North Carolina, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania really could run everything, and who would want that? Who would, incidentally? I don't know. Anyway, now you have these articles. Also, there would be a president who would preside over Congress, okay? That's what the presidents did. The Congress could also appoint a minister for foreign affairs and a minister for finance and a minister for Indian affairs, or minister of war, okay? So those are the things you would need. You're at war, so sure, you need a minister of war. You're going to have relations with other countries. You need a minister for foreign affairs, and you're going to be borrowing money, coining money. In fact, they start printing up money almost immediately in 1775, so you'll need a minister for finance to figure out how all of this works. Now, you create this system in 1777. The Congress debates it, deliberates over it, and then says, okay, this is the system we want. Then they send it out to the states to be ratified, but the states do not ratify it until 1781. So you had the Congress really functioning informally between 1774 and 1781. There's no ratification. No one had said, yes, this is the government we want, because they didn't think of it as a government. They had governments on the state level. They didn't think of this entity as a government of the United States. It was the way we may think of the United Nations. The United Nations doesn't have any power over us. Does it? Did I miss something? No. We do send delegates to it, and periodically they do have troops around the world, I understand, and they do other things. Can they tax us? No. I understand. I remember a few years ago the United Nations said the United States owed them a lot of money. Anyone hear anything about that?
Yeah, they didn't pay their dues. There's a due process.
Yeah, there are dues. Everyone's supposed to pay dues.
GDP, and we have the highest.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So did we ever pay them?
It goes back to
Yeah.
because nobody pays.
Nobody pays. Yeah. So why should we? We give them a place to meet, right? So if you don't pay your taxes, what's going to happen? Yeah. Sure. Okay. So what could the United Nations do to get its dues from us?
They write resolutions.
Write angry resolutions, letters to the editor of the New York Times, other things to try to get us to pay up. But so they don't have any enforcement power is the thing. Congress doesn't have any enforcement. We'll get to this, Congress and its enforcement power. But this is the way to think of the Continental Congress. It's this body chosen by the legislatures. These guys go and serve, and there's not really a whole lot they can do. They do borrow money. They do appoint, 1781, okay, let's get back to this. Congress does appoint a minister for finance. It appoints a minister for foreign affairs and a minister of war. Minister for finance is a guy named Robert Morris. Good guy to be a financier because he's really, really rich. Okay? And he tries to figure out what the total indebtedness is of the United States. And it's quite substantial. $42 million. This would be, sounds like nothing to us. Even if I tell you what it would be today, you say, oh, that's nothing. It was like $535 million in 1993. Boy, those people thought they had problems. The annual interest on this was about $2.5 million. Okay, so then it was a substantial debt. Remember, 3 million people owing about $500 million, or $42 million. You can do the math. So you have this big debt that's incurred as a result of fighting the war. And the debt is owed by the United States. Okay? This is one of the big problems here, and Morris recognizes it and tries to figure out a way to solve it. And The Congress cannot tax anyone because, why can't Congress tax anyone? Just say, yes?
They have no power to enforce it, so people could just not pay that.
Well, that's one thing. You'd say they have no power to enforce it, but they do have an army, right? And they do have these continental troops that...
Those are the people they would be taxing.
Well, they would be taxing these people, but Congress has raised a continental army, so why couldn't they use this army to get the states to pay up?
They couldn't afford to pay the army either.
Okay, that's another issue. They couldn't afford to pay the army, but let's think, yes?
Taxation was done by the states, they would infringe upon the states' function.
Okay, taxation's done by the states. That would infringe upon the states' functions. But let's think more, let's think more philosophically. Yes?
Maybe there's no money.
Well, there is money. Okay, here is the issue. Who elected Congress?
Not the people.
Not the people. The state legislatures elected Congress. None of you voted for members of Congress. Therefore, can Congress tax you? No. Why is that? That's taxation without representation. I mean, even Congress figures that out. Okay? So, and then there are these other issues. Yeah, we have this problem trying to pay the army and these other issues that some of you have mentioned. And Robert Morris suggests a couple of things. One is, how about if each state levies a tax of 5% on imports, and that will be a special tax to send to Congress? Okay? This is something we can do. We can get each state to levy a special tax. Problem is, well, 12 states say, okay, we'll levy a special tax. Rhode Island says, we're not levying a tax. So there's not going to be a tax because Rhode Island says no. You know, back when I first started teaching the course, it was always, boy, Rhode Island, what a bunch of bad guys. Now I guess more experience paying taxes and tax levying bodies. I think, boy, good for them. Is anyone here from Rhode Island? I wanted to thank you personally, just as I was thanking the Baptists earlier. Okay. So you have this big problem, and here's what happens. You know, Congress can tell each state how much they should send, much the way the United Nations tells us how much we should send. And over the years between 1781, when Congress started telling the states how much to send in, and 1786, Congress had told the states, send in, and it was a total of about $15.5 million. The states had sent in about $2.4 million. Okay? You know, the states weren't completely blowing off Congress, but they were, not sending that much. Because what can Congress do? Send troops? I'll tell you a story about Congress and troops in a little bit. Well, actually, I'll tell it to you now. 1783, soldiers from Pennsylvania, they are Continental soldiers in the Pennsylvania line. They realize the war is over. The British troops are now in the process of evacuating. A peace treaty has been signed. If we go home, we're never going to get paid. So the troops from Pennsylvania go to Philadelphia. They surround the State House, and they say, we're not leaving until we get paid. Soldiers from the Continental Army not attacking Congress, just surrounding Congress. Congress calls down the hall to the Pennsylvania legislature and says, you've got to do something to help us out. Pennsylvania has an executive council, and they suggest that the executive council summon the militia to disperse the Continental Army. And the authorities in Pennsylvania say, are you crazy? You want us to have our militia fighting with our soldiers in front of the State House? No, you caused this problem, you solve it. So Congress does negotiate a way out of this. The soldiers agree to let the congressmen leave. If the congressmen agree, they'll try to figure out a way to pay them. And so the Congress does leave. Remember, 1777, Congress had been driven out of Philadelphia by the British Army. In 1783, they're driven out of Philadelphia by the American Army. And they go on the run. They had been going on the run before when the British had occupied Philadelphia. They'd gone to other parts of Pennsylvania. They're incensed now at Pennsylvania. They're not going to stay in Pennsylvania any longer. So they go to New Jersey, to Trenton, Princeton, then they wind up down in Annapolis. Congress is on the road. Someone suggests, this is at a time these Frenchmen are experimenting with hot air balloons. Someone says, how about if we put Congress in a balloon? They could float from one end of the continent to the other. Make sure the continental requisitions are being upheld. They could pop down in any place where they are not. Now, congressmen, then as now, don't like being subject to ridicule. So they knew what they needed to do. What would you know you needed to do if you were a member of Congress? Well, you need to make a speech. Okay, that's one good thing you can do if you're a member of Congress. Someone wrote to Jefferson, who's the minister of France, every now and then we read about one of the honorable gentlemen taking a wife. Otherwise, we wouldn't know there was such a body as Congress. They decide what they're going to need to do is build their own capital. Okay? So they won't have to wander around. You know, in Maryland, they're meeting in the Maryland State House. They had been meeting in the New Jersey State House. And when they had been meeting in Pennsylvania's State House, you know, they were treated as these unwanted guests. Everywhere they went, they're going to need to build their own capital. So they debate, where should we build it? Now, there's one group that thinks it would be really good if the New England states and New York, New Jersey could get to it easily, and the best place for that is along the Delaware River, which is where we've had it. But we won't build it in Pennsylvania. We'll build it in New Jersey. And another group says, well, you know what? It's really inconvenient for guys from Virginia and North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia to get up to the Delaware River. How about if we build it on the Potomac River? Georgetown, Maryland would be a good spot for the capital. And they have plans drawn up, debates about which one would be better, and they can't decide, so they decide to build both. This is in 1785. They decide, okay, and we'll spend 1 year in Georgetown, 1 year in Lambertville, New Jersey, and we'll alternate. That way it'll be fair to everybody. So they decide they're going to build two capital cities. In the same year, they can't come up with enough money to pay their debt to the French. So the United States defaults on its loan from the French government in 1785. Has anyone here defaulted on a loan? I don't mean to single anyone out. Anyone here had a friend who defaulted on a loan? Makes it really hard to borrow money from anyone else. Here you're a country. The French had lent you all of this money. You can't pay them back, but you're going to build two capital cities. It's really an interesting turn of events here going on in Congress, which really is becoming irrelevant. Well, say no more about Congress. So Congress can't do anything. Okay? Now, some states are able to do things in this period to get out of debt. Let me just tell you a couple of cases of this because they're instructive. Okay, first, Virginia, biggest state. Had a big debt after the war, debt of about a little over 4 million pounds. Today that would be, what, about $248 million. Okay, again, seems like nothing to us. Boy, that's those were the days. I remember what, was it Everett Dirksen who said a million here, a million there, and soon you're talking about real money. Okay. The total state budget was about 250,000 pounds. So, okay, 250,000 pounds. The debt is 4.2 million pounds. The annual interest payment was about 200,000 pounds. So this interest payment consumes about, what is that, 4/5 of the state budget? Okay. So what could you do about this? Virginia, 748,000 people, largest state. And also at this time has probably the most imaginative political leadership. Imaginative in the best sort of way. You know, we can think of other imaginative things they could have done, a statewide Ponzi scheme or something like that. This is what they do. They set up 4 different tax zones. So the land is what's taxed in states, okay? And the relative value of the land is different. In the Tidewater, most valuable land. The Piedmont area, slightly less valuable, although in fact the Piedmont is a more fertile area at this point than the Tidewater. Different story. Then the mountainous area of what's now West Virginia, then Kentucky, okay? Now, most of the state debt is in the form of IOUs. The state had borrowed money during the war and now has to pay it back. It had borrowed money in a couple of ways. One, by outright borrowing money, so someone lends the money and he gets a promissory note from the state, or the state had all of these soldiers they had paid off with certificates that essentially were IOUs. Okay? So let's suppose this is an IOU for £100. Thank you for your service, and it's payable 10 years after the peace treaty is signed. Okay? So we muster you out in 1779, give you this IOU. 10 years after there's a peace treaty, you can get that in gold. Now, this is what's going to happen. There are lots of these certificates. What is it? About 4 million pounds worth of them circulating. Virginia gets them back by, taxing them, essentially. First, Virginia has a land tax, and it brings in about 128,000 pounds. It also taxes these certificates, because this is actually worth 100 pounds. Okay? The good news is you can pay your taxes in this. So he can actually pay his taxes with this, and we get it back. Or the other thing he can do is buy land in Kentucky with it, because we own the land. We got it from the Shawnee. So you can use this. You can either use this, stay there in the Tidewater and pay this in taxes, or you can give it to us and we'll give you land out in Kentucky. What do you want to do?
I'll buy the land.
He's going to go to Kentucky. Good for you. Good move. And this is what a lot of folks in Virginia do. They go out to Kentucky. And in 1779, there were 176 white people in Kentucky. By 1785, there were 30,000. By 1790, there were 73,000. So Virginia settles Kentucky at the same time as it extinguishes this debt by, taxing. By the way, the tax rate on these is 100%. These guys really are imaginative, okay? We're going to get these things back. Now, Massachusetts takes something of a different approach to this. Let me just explain what Massachusetts does, because it's also quite instructive. Massachusetts doesn't have a Kentucky that they can send people to or sell. They do have Maine, but Maine is owned by guys like James Bowdoin and Henry Knox and other guys who also are owed money because this is what happened. Massachusetts, the debt is about 1.4 million pounds. That would be about $64 million today. The annual interest payment was about 88,000 pounds. Now, here is what happened, too. Massachusetts had been involved in the war longer, had started accruing this debt in 1775. Okay? Massachusetts also sent more men into the armed forces than Virginia did. In fact, more than any other state. And we have a lot of these certificates out there. Okay? Now, this is what happened in Massachusetts, because Massachusetts also had the highest tax rate of any state. Tax on land, but also a poll tax. All of you who are over 16 had to pay £1 a year in gold to the state, just because you're you. Okay? That has to be paid in gold, whether you have gold or not. Okay, so let us suppose that our friend, you can be our soldier now. You were given the certificate. Thank you very much. That's worth £100 in 10 years, but now you owe me £1 in gold. Do you have it?
I have the certificate.
Well, I need gold.
No, I don't.
Well, you better come up with £1 in gold. Good news for you. This guy does have £1 in gold, which he'll sell you, give you the £1 of gold for that certificate. Good move. Okay, so this gentleman had something very important, which is gold, and he is now speculating, okay? He is gambling with this, that one day the state will be able to pay me £100. My investment now is £1. Usually it wouldn't be that dramatic. And you might hold out for money for seed, for other things you might need. So maybe £10 you'll sell that for. Would you buy that for £10? Okay, so he's buying up these certificates. Typically, he's a guy in Boston or Salem who has capital, which is a good thing to have. Okay, so he is buying up these certificates, giving you the gold, which you then give to me, the state, and then he also may own a store to sell you the other stuff you need. But this is what happens. He's buying up these certificates, and we, the legislature, decide, well, we're going to have to start paying off these certificates. And there's a big question. when we buy the certificate from him, what should we give him? Should we give him 10 pounds, which is what he paid for it, or 100 pounds? Why? You would say 10. You would say 100, of course. What's the argument for giving him 10 pounds? That's what he paid for it, okay? What's the argument for giving 100? It says 100. We owe you 100. It's a contract, right? We made a bargain that we're going to pay the holder of it. It says the bearer of this or the holder of this. It doesn't say, this guy who just spent 8 years fighting for you. It says the holder of this, and you sold it, so now it's yours. And you say, yes, 100, because if the state doesn't give you 100 pounds now, who is going to loan anything to the state in the future? If they're going to change the rules. So you definitely want 100 pounds, and the state, remember the state legislature in Massachusetts has one house that represents the common folk, so folks like you. Then there's one house that represents rich folks like you. And the Senate says, well, we have to pay this back in face value, because otherwise no one's going to loan money to us. And we need to have a stable business climate, and so on and so on. Good reasons here. And so the state says, well, we're going to pay these off at face value, not market value. And this essentially doubles what the debt was. We thought it was less because that was the market value of these certificates. It's actually much more. So what we do in order to make this up or pay this off is we raise taxes in Massachusetts. So now we're raising your taxes so that we can pay him. Do you like that?
Not really.
No, I wouldn't like it either. Does anyone like this? Other than you and me think this, we have to have a stable business community. We have to have a favorable climate for investors and speculate. He could have lost everything. Excuse me?
It is fair.
It is fair. Yeah.
He put up his goals.
Yeah, he did put up his goals. He didn't have to. And you could have been still sitting there with this worthless certificate, evicted from your house. The sheriff now could be auctioning off your farm. Thankfully, this guy paid your taxes, let you pay your taxes, right? And in fact, lots of people are losing their farms, getting evicted, and so on. So we're going to double taxes to pay off the speculators. Now, believe it or not, probably not in this institution, but in some parts of the state, people get really angry at this. And really angry when the people start losing their farms because they can't pay their taxes, or because they're so heavily in debt to speculators, they lose everything to these rapacious, blood-sucking insects, as I think they were called at the time. Nothing personal, of course. And the state sees we have a big problem here. And in 1784, with all of this pressure, the legislature decides we need to do something because people can't pay their taxes. So how about we not collect any taxes in 1784? A big tax, this is probably the biggest tax break in the history of Massachusetts. No taxes for anyone this year, okay? Now, every year we have an election for the legislature. Folks like this gentleman and me get kind of angry that we haven't been able to collect anything this year because there aren't any taxes being collected. We're not going to get paid off by the state, or paid by the state, I should say. Paid off has sinister connotations. So we get really angry. We get together and we elect a new legislature the following year. New legislature sees we have this big debt problem. What are we going to do about this debt? We're going to have to get the money from somewhere. We'll double the taxes. Not double from zero, but double from what they were back when we were collecting taxes. So Massachusetts in 1785 doubles the taxes as a way of paying off these investors like this gentleman who had the wherewithal to help, buy up certificates from hapless veterans like this fellow. Okay. You know what happens next? Actually, armed mobs start taking over courts in western Massachusetts and in Bristol County and in other places, saying, this state government is out of hand. We need to do something to bring the state government more in line with the people of Massachusetts. These courts that are hearing suits for debt, they shut them down. Now, there had been a time in Massachusetts history when armed folks had shut down courts and had blasted this unresponsive government. That was back when the government was across the ocean. Now the government's in Boston. And there are charges that Boston is in the hands of these, before it was Boston's in the hands of this angry mob. That was 1765. Now Boston is in the hands of this urban elite who are having tea-drinking orgies and getting rich at the expense of the veterans and the others who carried this burden. So there are demands from Western Massachusetts to cut the taxes. That's one thing. Stop these suits for debt. Move the capital out of Boston. Move it to Worcester or somewhere else. Not in Boston, which has become this bastion of power and privilege. One group tries to storm the arsenal out in Springfield to seize the weapons. And they have county conventions that convene to condemn the way the state government is going. By the way, where do you think Samuel Adams stands on all of this? These angry folks in Western Massachusetts, upset with the tenor of the state government, which has lost touch with the common people. Excuse me? You'd say probably with them, and you'd be wrong. He thinks these are traitors. They're traitors. Okay? We had rebelled against a distant monarchical government. They were rebelling against the people's government. You cannot rebel against the people's government. How can you? We now have a different government. You can't rebel against it. If you do, you're a traitor. You should be hung. Which also is the position Governor James Bowdoin takes, that we need to hang these people, make examples of them. They do send troops out to suppress this rebellion, and they do suppress it. The rebellion kind of dies out. Interesting story about it, but it is suppressed, dies out, and Abigail Adams is really irate too about this whole episode. She's in Paris, but she's just London, but she's just outraged that they're rebelling against the state government. How can they do that? Because this is a good government. It's not like the old one. Her husband is a little more moderate on it, but she's really surprised when Jefferson writes from Paris about what a good thing this is. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. He said, I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and as natural in the political world as storms in the physical. It's a great line, isn't it, that this is a good thing. And also he says, look, we've now been independent for 12 years. Actually, 13 states have been independent for 12 years. So that's actually 13 times 12. How long is that? It's like 150 something. 150 years. One rebellion in 150 years is pretty good. Shays Rebellion. Daniel Shays is a veteran of the the state militia. Continental is the state militia, and he becomes a leader of this rebellion. And there is something, Shays with an S, and there's some worry, well, what would have happened had Shays been a military genius instead of just kind of an okay soldier? And he doesn't really start this. He just is the guy who has military experience. So he's the one leading the troops against the state government. Winds up going across the border into Vermont, as do a lot of the other guys. What happens is this. I think 2 guys are hung actually for rape or murder, not for rebellion. James Bowdoin, the governor, wants to make more examples, but he's voted out in April of 1787. John Hancock becomes the governor, and he pardons everybody and tones things down and resolves this politically as opposed to judicially. Okay, so you have this big problem in Massachusetts with debt that they don't solve. And they try to raise taxes and pay off the debt. They can't do it. And so guys like this gentleman are still holding on to that certificate, waiting to be paid. Certainly guys like this gentleman aren't taking up arms against the government because they want the government to survive so that it can pay them. Rhode Island has kind of a different situation. They have a debt which they simply erase. In Rhode Island, the legislature is elected every 6 months. And they have this policy. They draw up a law in Rhode Island. Okay, let's suppose you have this similar debt. You've paid him 10 pounds in gold. He then owes you 10 pounds in gold. You don't have 10 pounds in gold to pay him back, but you might have, let's say you have a barn filled with corn you offer him. Will you take a barn filled with corn?
I don't know what I'm going to do with that.
So you'd say no. Good. We all heard him say no. This gentleman offered him something to repay his debt. He said no. Debt's canceled. There are apocryphal stories of creditors running for the Massachusetts border followed by someone with a wheelbarrow filled with something they're trying to offer, so that the guy can say no, and then the debt's canceled. Now, so Rhode Island, I don't know, would you want to invest in Rhode Island? Would anyone want to loan money in Rhode Island? No, probably not. You want to borrow money in Rhode Island. Just historically, more people are debtors than creditors, so this is going to be a big issue, okay? Small number of people had the capital to lend out. More people had the money, borrowed. So you'll see lots of discussion in this period about minority and majority interests. The biggest one is creditors and debtors, and always more debtors than creditors. Okay, so these are a couple of the things happening here in the 1780s. You have a Congress that really can't do anything. You have states that are coming up with different ways of solving this problem, but there's no real way for the states to take any concerted action. And you have this growing problem. I mean, the debt, yeah, it's a big problem in Massachusetts. Probably no way they're going to be able to solve it. Virginia was able to solve it because they had Kentucky. And Congress can't pay the debts the United States owes because it can't tax anyone. So how could you solve all of this? And then you have these other problems which actually don't loom as large. It's the big problem of debt. You have this other problem in the 1780s. As the states are coming up with ways to solve their problems, they're running into conflict with other states. Just here's an example. Chesapeake Bay is a very important navigation route, not only into Virginia and Maryland, but into Pennsylvania. And also Delaware. There's one way you get to Delaware is by, I'm going to get you all confused about geography, and someone's going to go looking for Delaware by way of Maryland. But anyway, you bring a ship into the Chesapeake. Let's say you're bound for Chestertown, Maryland. Where should you pay taxes? Can Maryland tax your cargo? In fact, tariffs, there's a big way the states raise money. Should you have to pay a tax when you get to Chesterton, Maryland, under Maryland law? Not should you, but will you? Yes, the answer is yes, because Maryland does have a law. You bring a cargo into Maryland, you have to pay a tax. Well, what about if Virginia has a law? If you sail past Portsmouth, you have to pay a tax there. So if you're bringing a cargo into Maryland, will you have to pay a tax in Virginia? Probably, because Virginia is going to insist on it. Virginia's going to have customs inspectors out on Chesapeake Bay making sure you pay your tax. You'll say, oh, I'm just going up to Chesterton, Maryland. Well, how do we know that? How do we know you're not going to pull up somewhere on the Chesapeake and start unloading this stuff without paying taxes to anyone? The only way to make sure you do pay taxes is you have to stop in Portsmouth and pay taxes. Do you think Maryland's going to like this? Everyone coming up to Maryland has to pay taxes in Virginia first? No. And let's suppose you say you're actually going up to the Susquehanna River, and you get there by going by the Chesapeake. So you're trying to get to Pennsylvania, but first you have to pay taxes in Virginia, taxes in Maryland. What's going to happen is no one's going to go to the Chesapeake at all. Similar thing is is happening in New York Harbor. New York Harbor is bounded by New Jersey and Connecticut, as well as New York. So who should collect taxes there? All three of them want to, right? Which means no one's going to want to do business in New York either, okay? And in Massachusetts, Massachusetts has a fairly high tariff rate. Rhode Island doesn't charge anyone taxes. So if you want to sell stuff in Massachusetts, you're going to want to go by way of Rhode Island, because that way you don't have to pay any taxes, right? What can Massachusetts do about that? Nothing. Again, 3 cheers for Rhode Island. They've really... So you have these problems brewing, and the Virginians realize what a big problem this is, okay? So Virginia, they also recognize Congress can't do anything about this. Congress has its own problems, trying to build a capital city. Congress is also trying to resolve this border dispute between Connecticut and Pennsylvania, which they do. They say the land belongs to Pennsylvania, and the Pennsylvania sends their militia to clear out these people from Connecticut. It's the dead of winter. Bad public relations move on the part of Pennsylvania. Just a warning to you if you ever are in this situation. Anyway, Virginia calls a conference. They hold it at Mount Vernon. The delegates from commissioners from Maryland and Virginia get together to talk about this problem of navigation of the Chesapeake Bay. Who should control the Chesapeake Bay? And these are, guys who are really thinking about this problem. Virginia didn't come there saying, we want to control Chesapeake Bay, and Maryland didn't say, we want to control Chesapeake Bay. They realized they had to do something together, or no one would use Chesapeake Bay. And as they are talking, they realize it's actually a bigger problem than Maryland, Virginia, because North Carolina abuts Chesapeake Bay, Delaware has an interest in Chesapeake Bay, Pennsylvania has an interest in Chesapeake Bay. Maybe what we should do is have a conference of all of these states to talk about how we can resolve this problem or these problems of trade. And they're right. So in September 1786, they have another meeting at Annapolis, and this time there are 12 guys from 5 states. And one of the guys is Alexander Hamilton, who had been an aide to Washington during the war, and Hamilton had been in Congress for a while. He saw how ineffective Congress was, various problems in Congress which I mentioned, and they say, how about we have all of the states meet to talk about ways we can make the system work, or ways Congress can change the confederation system so that we can won't have problems like this. Very important that these guys get together in Annapolis and say, we have this big problem, and it's bigger simply than these states adjoining Chesapeake Bay. Because we can see a similar problem in New York, similar problem Rhode Island, Massachusetts, so it's a problem throughout the country. And some of these guys think, well, we need to do is scrap the system entirely, start over. And they actually do tell one another that. They don't publicly say, hey, let's scrap the system. They say, have the states choose delegates to meet in Philadelphia in May of 1787 to come up with ways of making the Articles of Confederation, or making the Articles consistent, or Articles necessary, or adequate. I'm sorry, that's the word we're looking for, to the needs of the Union. Now, Congress doesn't do anything about this. I mean, they get this report saying, call a conference. Congress doesn't do anything, but the legislatures of 12 states do appoint delegates to this meeting, which will happen in Philadelphia. Okay? One of the most important developments in the meantime, between the Annapolis Conference in the fall of 1786 and the opening of the conference in May of 1787, is not Shays' Rebellion, which I've told you about. Instead, it's James Madison writing a memo to himself, The Vices of the Political System. What's wrong with the political system as it exists? It seems fairly obvious. Congress can't tax anyone. States are doing all kinds of crazy things. These are the problems. Easy enough to see these are problems. More difficult thing, what's the solution to this? And it's the solution we will be talking about next week. Meanwhile, I will post Madison's 11 Vices of the Political System, so you can think about what it is he thought were the problems in the political system. So that's enough for tonight. Next time, we'll figure out our way out of this mess.